The work that we do as developers of color isn't easy. We do it in an industry that oftentimes deprioritizes us and our perspectives. It's part of the reason why we have Game Devs of Color Expo, to make a space where we can reprioritize ourselves and our experiences, where we can learn skills, create our worlds, perhaps even speak truth to power. Of course, as a game developer, there are more ways to speak truth to power than just making games. Our next speakers are a pair of associate professors who have assembled a collection of essays and roundtable interviews. These focus in on the experience of Asian Americans, but it features developers from around the world. Now, this particular collection of essays highlights some of the ties between Western imperialism and the game industry. Since it was written during the last 4 years, over the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, there's certainly a lot to understand here. To present the process of assembling these essays and some of the takeaways they found, please welcome Christopher B. Patterson and Tara Fickle.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Chris Patterson, and this is Tara Fickle, and we are the co-editors of a new and free-to-read collection of essays and roundtable interviews on video games and Asia/America, entitled Made in Asia America: Why Video Games Were Never Really About Us, released this April with Duke University Press. The collection brings together game scholars and game makers to discuss the ways that video games intersect with American empire and with our own racial imaginations, and offer new ways of trying to transform both. Our collection is the result of many collaborations within and outside the Academy, and we learned a great deal about the ways that game communities are built. So Tara and I are both game makers, having dabbled in and out of game design throughout our careers. And we have kept in frequent community and friendship with game makers, especially those who identify as Asian North American. So part of our mission today is to use our experience making this collection to show the ways that collaborations have been possible among game scholars like ourselves, game players, and game makers. So first, we want to introduce ourselves. I'm Chris. I'm a writer and educator in the Social Justice Institute at the University of British Columbia. I am author of the book Open World Empire: Race, Erotics, and the Global Rise of Video Games. I was the lead story writer and developer for this game, which is my background, and you see on the slide. Stamped, an anti-travel game, which is an adaptation of my first novel about a group of young queer BIPOC travelers living in Asia. I identify as multiply queered, queer, genderqueer, they, he pronouns, neuroqueer, and a mixed brown queer, Philipixie punk.
And I'm Tara. I use she, her pronouns, and I teach at Northwestern University in the Asian American Studies program. And before Made in Asia/America, I wrote a book called The Race Card, which re-examines the history of Asian American racialization through the lens of gaming, gambling, and strategic risk. And as Chris mentioned, I've also dabbled in and out of game creation, mostly text-based games. And I regularly teach classes at Northwestern on race and gaming, where students create simple text-based or platformer games using Twine and Stencil.
So we're going to begin by just giving you some details about how we made the collection. Made in Asia America, we're very proud of. It's the very first edited collection that explores how video games take a domineering role within the race makings of Asia and America. And we seek to reframe recent discussions of games, which seem to focus on self-representation and identity, to understanding the various ways that Asia, America, and games have been historically entangled, how games have offered new ways of imagining empire, imperial violence, racial difference, as well as coalition. Although there have been important scholarship works on race, gender, and sexuality in games, most North American game scholars often talk about games as if they're totally separate from Asia, where so many games are made and played and disposed of. So we wanted to think about these things together, in addition to addressing what it means to be Asian American in the game industry today and as players as well. By centering these Asian American intimacies, Tara and I undertook what we came to call an interactive editorial method that tries to highlight the important conversations among Asian American game designers concerning the ways that their games are interpreted and remade. So like Kirby sucking in a bad guy, we imagined interaction as something that allowed us to create something new with every encounter, and encounters with game makers, with game players especially, and gives it something that gives us space to reform and expand and go in very unexpected directions. So put simply, interactivity for us helped us explore how game making was also a form of world making, as well as risking the possibilities of change, the strengthening and transitioning into something new. So during the 4 years that Tara and I worked on this collection, and 4 years is about average, if anyone's wondering, for a collection like this, but we sought to practice interaction in 4 different ways. So first, we wrote the call for papers in a way that asks the writers to explore open-ended questions that ask how games can change our everyday notions of race, gender, and American empire. Second, during our feedback sessions, we advocated for the writers to write short chapters so that we can allow more space for greater diversity of ideas and contexts. And we also encourage contributors to exchange work with each other, and to see their own work not as like argumentative or academic, but as playful experimentations. The collection's conclusion, for example, we wrote after we had done most of the interviews and was inspired by our interactions with game writers and developers and players. Third, we sought to disrupt the scholarly field of game studies by inviting a diverse array of game makers into the collection who identified as Asian, North American, and as marginalized, as neurodiverse, queer, transgender, or non-binary, as indigenous, mixed white, Latinx, and Arab, as lacking formal education, as non-native English speaking, as living outside North America. So we hosted 5 of these roundtables of 4 game makers each, and sought to understand the ways that they understood how race was depicted in their games. And we conducted these roundtables over Zoom in the spring of 2021 during a global pandemic, which was an interesting way to go. What was happening around us was always within our conversations. The playful space of games provided some opportunity to reflect on the increasingly serious and increasingly anti-Asian world around us. That was also punctuated by unexpected moments of connection and community, in many cases facilitated by video games. So when we were finished with the interviews, we decided not to like bunch them all into one section of the book, but to spread them out into all the different sections to introduce each section so that readers had to kind of confront the different contexts where the game makers were based. We had game makers coming from Tokyo, from New York, from Hawaii, from Hong Kong, from Toronto, from Shanghai, from Manila. And so we tried to think of the roundtables less as guided interviews and more as spaces of interactive play. And it was important for us while doing so to foster community among developers who didn't know of each other at the time or hadn't yet met at the time. Number 4, and lastly, we attempted to practice interaction by organizing and hosting an ongoing panel series at the annual Association of Asian American Studies Conference, or AAAS, which is an ethnic studies kind of space that has unfortunately had very little concern for video games or their worldwide impacts. So in 2018, we hosted the first ever panel focused on video games at AAAS. And then we followed this up year after year, interacting with more scholars featured in the collection, as well as bringing game makers to that space like Robert Yang and Marina Kataka. The results were not only in this collection, but in events outside academia. So for example, on my campus, we had this humongous game expo, the biggest game expo ever on my campus, that we organized through a lot of the same networks. And then in 2021, we also had the hashtag Stop Asian Hate Jam, Game Jam, that was organized on itch.io by myself and by our contributors, Mike Ren-E, Pamela Punzalan, and Melos Hantani, game makers who all met each other through our roundtables. So that's it for me. Let me shoot it off to Tara.
Thanks, Chris. Today, we wanted to share a couple of takeaways from the developer roundtables that Chris just talked about, and to talk a little bit about what we as academics also learned from conducting them. I wanted to show, this is a map of the developers that we spoke to. And as Chris mentioned, they really hailed from a wide variety of locations, which we sought out intentionally, and we think gave us a more global and diverse range of perspectives than one normally gets when speaking about game development. And in particular, we wanted to expand our discussion of Asian video games to consider places like China, the Philippines, Hong Kong, and also to think about how local markets there coexisted with partner studios and to be able to talk about issues of localization. And as a reminder, all of these roundtables, as well as the whole collection with all of the essays, are free to read online. And we hope that making this book open access itself, which costs 10,000 US dollars, is itself a way of fostering broader community conversations outside an academic paywall. And I bring up that dollar amount partly to just express our gratitude to the institutions that helped make this possible, which was the University of British Columbia and the University of Oregon. So today we thought there would be kind of two takeaways we wanted to talk about that would be particularly relevant for this audience. And the first one comes from our roundtable with Patrick Miller, who is a designer and editor at Riot Games and also a former esports competitor himself. And he says, if you're ever wondering why video games are the way they are, the place that I would start is economics. Video games are expensive as hell to make, and this is a hits-driven industry. So that means the more you increase your possibility for scale, in general, the higher your risk. And so you're going to have to make the game more broadly appealing to try and minimize risk. When you look at the prospect of trying to do interesting, personal, smaller scale games, the people who have the skills that you need to satisfy the vision that you want are going to be too expensive to justify taking that risk. However, the entire world has been subject to Hollywood movies and subsequently American imperialist propaganda for decades. So if you want to sell someone on a fantasy of playing a white dude with a gun, everyone around the world has been exposed to that multiple times, right? So that blueprint already exists. So in other words, what Patrick was drawing our attention to is how the game industry continues to rest on an implicit assumption that whiteness is the most low-risk, cost-effective representation, even if that's not actually the case. A report a couple of months ago by the consulting firm McKinsey showed that lack of representation actually constitutes a huge amount of loss to Hollywood through untapped markets. But there's still a guiding assumption that whiteness is something that helps you inhabit this thing called character fantasy, or what's been called elsewhere character immersion. I'm sorry, game immersion. And this idea of character fantasy, or in this case, what Patrick is calling playing a white dude running around with a gun, is something so important, I think, that we as academics can sometimes overlook too, especially when we're thinking about immersion in more technical terms as a game theory, or discussing the aesthetics of why a character might look the way that they do. Because I think Patrick is really helpfully pointing us to the fact that it's not just about designing characters that look more like the people playing them, in other words, mirroring identity and representation, the way that Chris mentioned earlier. It's also about cashing in and recognizing the global appeal of imperialist fantasy. And in other words, the history of how things like colonialism continue to inform things like game design, even though that connection might not be immediately obvious. The second takeaway comes from Naomi Clark, the professor at NYU's Game Center, and it's about how a different kind of stereotype informs the game industry. So as Naomi put it, there's a general prejudice against East Asian creative professionals, probably especially Chinese people, but also Japanese and Korean. Like, oh, you're probably good at programming, and if you're Korean, you can definitely make artwork. You can do character designs, but we're going to write the character ideas. As a writer, I think there's a bunch of racism working against you. There are also these diversity and inclusion efforts that sometimes make the assumption that Asians are already overrepresented in the game industry. And the reason I pulled this quote is, as we talked about, this is really an example of why representation in terms of the raw number of Asian faces at the table or on the screen in games is insufficient as a metric for making inclusive games. Because as Professor Clark here reminds us, statistics about racialized game characters themselves often conflate Asian and Asian American by including characters from Asian-made, especially Japanese video games, giving the false impression that Asian American characters are overrepresented instead of underrepresented. And we thought that this would be a takeaway for those who make games as well as those who study them. The need to think about in what areas greater representation is occurring in terms of so-called above and below the line creation industries, but also how the very notion of creativity continues to get racialized as white. So one of the lessons that we learned from editing this collection and conducting the roundtables was just how incredibly important it is for good game scholarship to really understand game development. In other words, how games are actually made. And this may seem completely obvious to people who make games, but it's actually really rare, we found, to find those sorts of collaborations that we tried to pursue through this collection. So this experience has also really inspired us to continue working with developers in other venues. So beyond the expos and panels that we've organized that Chris mentioned, I also just wanted to highlight one format, which is guest speaking in our classrooms that has been really incredibly generative and communal. So for example, this last year, some of my students in the Asian American gaming class I taught were really lucky to have developers visit our class and answer their questions. So just a kind of shout out and thank you to Cici Jiang, Genova Chen, Chris, Marina Kataka, and Justin Chang for that. And I mention this partly because this experience of guest speaking has not just been a way to recognize developer labor and honor their knowledge through classroom honoraria, but the developers really emphasized also how valuable this kind of classroom speaking experience is. Just in terms of what you might expect, students are, of course, interested in the day-to-day of what your job is like, but the questions are really also focused on their interest in understanding how decisions get made. What are developer thoughts on race, on culture, on theories of game design, and how those all interact together with the kind of hunger for marketing of diversity. So we really hope to continue to promote collaboration and communication within and among academics and game makers through those classroom spaces, but also more broadly. So please do feel free to contact us if you're interested in collaborating or in joining our classes as a guest speaker. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that talk, Christopher and Tara. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that doing any of this work as people of color in any time, but particularly over these past 4 years, moving forward, is tough. But I do think that there's genuine power in sharing these stories and learning about the experiences of others, reprioritizing ourselves and our experiences, finding value in ourselves and each other, and doing our work in a way that lifts us all up. It might be abstract, but I believe it nevertheless. I feel it when I see the works of people who gather in a space like this. So thank you to Christopher Patterson, to Tara Fickle, to all of the contributors of Made in Asia America. If you'd like to read it yourself, you can find it for free on the Open Access Library. You can also find it at Duke University Press. Search for Made in Asia / America, Why Video Games Were Never Really About Us.